Hi, this is Jason Baker, and welcome to our weekly lecture on DevOps and cloud infrastructure. This week, we are going to talk about DevOps practices. And it's been a while since we've talked about DevOps specifically. I gave you an introduction to DevOps practices in the very first lecture in this course. And our over the past couple weeks, the lectures have been very technical. And so this week it's sort of a change of pace, and many students kind of like this change of pace. Instead of talking about technology, we're going to talk more about sort of the business of technology and how we go about introducing change, whether that be infrastructure change or software changes, into our organization, and how do we process and manage that change? How do we effectively build software applications? How do we effectively manage data within our organizations? All these things and more will be discussed in this week's lecture. Let's take a look at the agenda then. I'll begin the lecture by briefly talking about DevOps again and helping you sort of reorient yourself as to the meaning of DevOps. You'll find that much of DevOps and the practices that we follow are heavily influenced by lean theory. And so there's going to be a segment of this lecture that is specifically focused on lean. And then we're going to cover some of the sort of the key characteristics and components of DevOps practices, starting with DevOps culture. And this is sort of a preface to the lecture, but you'll find that that the culture is one of the most important aspects of DevOps within an organization. I'll talk about things like design for operations and infrastructure as code and code pipelines. Uh, the latter two things are we're going to have entire lectures later on in this course that are focused on infrastructure as code and how to build software code pipelines. And so this will be sort of a quick introduction to those future lecture segments. So let's jump in. Okay. Well, we started the semester talking about DevOps, but let's think about the meaning of DevOps once again and sort of reorient ourselves to this term. When I talk about DevOps in the context of this course, I'm talking about a set of processes, a methodology. You can think of it almost as a culture that is formed within an organization. And the purpose of this culture is to develop a collaborative effort to improve the quality and velocity of our service lifecycle within our organizations. Well, you probably understand the word collaborative, right? Collaborative means that you have different groups of people within the organization that are working together to you know to to successfully complete a some sort of shared goal. And in the context of DevOps, when different teams in the organization are collaborating, they're usually collaborating because they want to improve the quality of a service. Maybe they're trying to improve the quality of the software that they're writing within the organization. Maybe they're trying to improve the quality of the machine learning algorithms that they're creating or the data processing workflows. They're also not just trying to improve quality, but they're trying to improve the velocity of the service lifecycle. And so you think of this in the context of something like software development. Traditionally, in software development, we would we would work on our software product and we'd be making changes over the course of months. And maybe once a quarter or maybe a couple times a year, we would release updates to our software application. Well, that sort of service release velocity may have worked just fine 10 years ago, but in the modern age of cloud infrastructure and mobile applications, our customers are now much more technically savvy and they demand faster change. They demand faster improvement in the services that we're delivering to them. And so instead of waiting months to release new change to our software applications, our customers are expecting us to release changes every week, maybe even every day. And so we have to work together within an organization to figure out, well, how do we improve the quality and the velocity of our services? And we do that by implementing DevOps practices. You might be asking yourself the question, is this whole DevOps thing, is this really new? Now, if you're like me and you've been working in the technology industry for 20 years or more, it's likely that you've encountered some of these DevOps practices before. They might have been called something different, or they may have taken some different form, but they do in some ways look familiar. I think what's new with DevOps is that we're building on decades of practices that we've been following in the industry, and DevOps I think represents a way of sort of distilling these practices down to the set of practices that really seem to matter and make a difference within our organization. And DevOps also greatly focuses on the culture of the organization, and it recognizes that without the right culture in place, it doesn't matter what sort of technology tools or processes you follow, because if you don't have the right culture, it's unlikely that your company is going to be able to succeed in improving the quality and velocity of your services. So despite the fact that many of these practices aren't necessarily new, what I think is really interesting is that today companies still encounter challenges, and one of the most familiar challenges that companies encounter is exemplified by this slide. And this is a meme where it's sort of a typical situation where a software developer says, hey, I wrote some code and that code worked just fine on my local development workstation. But once I gave that code to the operations team and they deployed it into production, now that code blew everything up. So, hey, my code worked just fine in dev. It's somebody else's problem to deal with it. And that's a very, very common scenario that you find in technology organizations. And this goes back decades. And it's because there's this sort of natural silo that set of silos that forms within a technology organization. And generally on one side you have the members of the software development team, and on the other side you have the operations team. The development team is responsible for writing software. They're responsible for making change happen. And the operations team then is responsible for deploying those changes and into a production environment and making sure that production environment stays up and running 24/7. So that operations team, they desire stability more than anything else. And I bet if you look at your own organization or other organizations, what you'll find most often is that these two teams are distinctly separate teams. Usually what I'll find is that the development team is on one floor of a building and the operations team is on a different floor. In fact, I work in an organization where the development team is in one part of the country and the operations team is in a completely different part of the country. So, you know, so there's very little interaction between these teams other than when things are being thrown over the wall, when code is being thrown over the wall from the development team to the operations team, and the operations team is being asked to make it work. And we call this wall the wall of confusion because it's sort of this natural barrier that forms between the development team and the operations team. One of the key goals of DevOps practices then is to break through this wall, is to figure out a way for the development team and the operations team to collaborate with one another and to work much more closely with one another. That's where the term DevOps comes from. Dev comes from development and ops comes from operations. It's a combination of the two. One of the challenges that we have in terms of trying to combine these sort of two teams within the organization is that both of these teams have conflicting measures of success. You think about your software development team, that software development team, the success of that team is measured by key performance indicators like the rate of change during a release cycle, the number of lines of code they create or code commits, how many stories in the agile sprint that they're able to complete, how many story points have they completed. So the development team is measured by the amount of change that they can make happen within the company. The operations team, on the other hand, is measured by things like service availability and uptime, service performance. And so the operations team is trying to minimize the amount of change to the environment because in their minds, the less the environment changes, the more stable it is. I'm going to show you here in a bit that that is actually a falsehood, but that's the way most operations teams work. They're measured by stability, not by change. And this leads to um, challenges when we talk about managing change within technology organizations. So, and it when you talk about change in a technology organization, oftentimes companies will speak in terms of change management or risk management. Because anytime you make a change to something, whether it's a software application or a service that you've deployed, there is some amount of risk that you're going to introduce a defect or introduce some sort of customer impacting event. And so traditionally in IT organizations, the way we managed the the risk of introducing change was by changing as infrequently as we possibly could, or we would only make changes within the organization when absolutely necessary. So because change was risky, we tried not to change very often. And when we had to make changes within within our technology platform, we would make those changes at really inconvenient times. So like if we were going to schedule a change to our service that we're using to support customers, we might make that change at 2 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday morning because this if we're like a business to business type of company, then that change is unlikely to impact customers as much versus if we were to make that change in the middle of the day on a Wednesday afternoon. And so the problem with making changes at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning is that typically our staff members aren't working during that time of day. And so they're going to come in, they're going to be tired, they're going to be cranky, and if they encounter problems at 2 a.m. and they need to reach out to vendors for help, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to reach the true experts at their vendor companies, because the experts are probably also asleep at that time of day. And so we're introducing change at really inconvenient times. And because we don't change very often, when we do decide to make changes within the organization, we traditionally we would tend to batch these changes together into a change window. So we would collect all the changes that we need to make over the course of a month, and we would try to push all those changes through in like a 1 hour maintenance window at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And I can tell you from experience that like this fails at least 50% of the time. Almost, I mean, it's I've worked with some organizations where it failed almost 100% of the time. When I say fail, I mean that the organization expected to make these changes within an hour, a 1 hour time window, but the changes actually took much longer than expected. Maybe the changes took 2 hours or 4 hours. I worked with an organization, a customer, 2 years ago where they said that they had a 2 hour maintenance window on a Saturday to make a set of changes, and they broadcast this maintenance window out to their customers. Well, this 2 hour maintenance window turned into a 16-hour maintenance window. 16 hours where their service was unavailable. So the risk here is that we're batching up a lot of change and trying to push it through in a small period of time, simply because we decided we're not going to change very often. And when we do change, we're going to change at really inconvenient times. This is the way that things have been done for decades within the technology industry. I think what this also leads to, in some cases, is what I call the slippery slope of IT change management. So, slippery slope means that this is sort of the unintended consequence of making changes infrequently within our organization. So, the thought process goes like this. We know that change is inherently risky in our technology organization. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have a choice. There's constant change within the organization, right? There's constant changes that we need to make. There are security patches we need to apply to software applications. There are new code libraries and new code fixes that need to be put in place. Our customers are constantly pressuring us to build new features. And so we don't have a choice. That changes will simply begin to accrue and pile up over time. But because change is risky within our organizations, we try not to make changes very often. The longer that we wait to make changes, the more things that we inevitably have to change, because these changes are just constantly coming at us. And we're having to sort of stockpile and accrue change over time. The problem then is that as we begin to accrue more change, the amount of risk that we're taking on also increases, because we're not just changing one or two things. Now we have a batch of 10 changes or 20 changes or maybe even 100 changes that we need to make. So the problem then that you encounter, and this sort of slippery slope that you fall into when making change management and trying to manage change within technology organizations, is that the more infrequently you change things, the greater the risk becomes to your organization. I think of it like a balloon. Think of a balloon that it contains change, and over time that as the amount of change grows, the balloon grows bigger and bigger and bigger until it explodes. And that's the current state that you find in many, if not most, technology organizations, is that they are accruing change over time, and at some point in time it bursts, and they experience a service outage, they experience problems, or they try to deploy a new version of their application suite, and they deploy that application suite and it's got so many changes in it that invariably it negatively impacts customers. So we're going to go, the purpose of this lecture today is to really figure out, how do we effectively make change within our organization? And DevOps really shows us the way. And there are three sort of key components to DevOps that I'm going to cover in this week's lecture. The first one is culture. And I'll tell you right now that culture is by far the most important component of DevOps. You cannot build an effective DevOps organization without focusing time and attention and effort on building the right culture. It simply will not happen without the culture component. The second piece is automation. And we've talked a little bit about automation in the second lecture this semester, and you already know that we try to automate everything. And it's a really key component and fundamental practice that we follow in DevOps. And finally, measurement. Measurement's important because it's a feedback mechanism. And we need to understand if the things and the practices that we're following, if those practices are actually improving the quality of our services and improving the velocity of our services. We need to be able to make measurements, and we need to use things like telemetry to figure out if the things we're doing are actually improving the business. Now, before I jump into those key components, I want to dispel some common DevOps misconceptions that you may encounter not only within your organization, but in the broader marketplace. Misconception number one is we have to hire special DevOps people and we have to build a DevOps team within our organization in order to implement these practices. That's absolutely false. And unfortunately, I see many companies, especially in my area, the Twin Cities region, falling into this trap. And I see recruiters, and I have these recruiters reach out to me every week, and they're telling me that they need to hire DevOps people. They need to hire DevOps engineers, which makes absolutely no sense to me. Because think about it. How many companies hire Agile engineers? Have you ever heard of an Agile engineer? No. We hire software engineers. We don't hire Agile engineers or waterfall engineers or extreme programming engineers. We hire software engineers. We then follow an Agile methodology within the organization to build our software application. The same thing is true of DevOps. I don't hire DevOps engineers. I might hire systems engineers or release engineers or site reliability engineers. And I'll hire software engineers. And all of these engineers will follow DevOps practices, just like they follow Agile practices. I don't need to build a DevOps team because the goal of DevOps is not to build another silo. The goal of DevOps is to introduce a culture and set of practices that our software development teams, our operations teams, our quality assurance teams are going to follow. So I don't need to build yet another separate type of team in order to follow DevOps practices. I need all of my existing technology teams to follow DevOps practices. Second misconception. This DevOps thing it's just all about automating all of the things in my company. That's what DevOps is about. Well, That's sort of true. DevOps is, automation is really a key component, and it's a key practice that we follow in a DevOps organization. But if there's one thing I want to leave you with in this lecture is that DevOps is mostly about the culture. It's mostly about building this sort of shared responsibility for service delivery in our organization. It's about the collaborative nature between our different technology teams. It's the collaboration that forms. It's the focus on service quality and service velocity. That's the key to DevOps. Automation is something that's going to help you uh, build better service velocity, and it's going to help you improve quality. But if you don't have the right culture in place, then you're not going to have a culture which really strongly promotes automation. You're not going to have a culture which really promotes the right things. Third misconception. Well, if we want to build a DevOps organization, um, we have to go out and buy these DevOps tools. So, my company is currently using DevOps tools, therefore we must be doing DevOps. Totally false. There are all kinds of vendors out there in the marketplace that are pushing different kinds of tools. These are software development tools or infrastructure management tools or telemetry tools, and they all are trying to sell you. They're trying to sell your CIO on the fact that, hey, if you buy my special magic tool, then you're going to be transformed into a DevOps organization. Absolutely not true. I've never worked with a company that went out and bought a tool and was suddenly able to transform their culture and transform the organization just because they bought some tool. And guess what? Most of the companies that I've consulted with over the years that are really struggling to build a DevOps culture and adopt these practices, many of them already have the sort of tools that you would associate with the DevOps organization. Most of them already have infrastructure as code tools or configuration and management infrastructure definition tools, software development pipelines. Most of them already have the tooling in place. What they don't have is the culture. So, with that being said, so now that you know some of the misconceptions about DevOps, and some of these probably sound familiar to you, or at least ring true in your own organization, the next step is to really understand how do you build a DevOps culture, and what are some of the key sort of components that you would find in a DevOps organization.